Welcome, David. Thank you for coming to Authors. And David Moore is the author of Smart Yoga, as the Americans called it. What was the original title, David?
Yoga and the Alexander Technique. I'll explain how we got to have two titles.
Yes.
Yeah.
David is in Melbourne. He is the head of a school, and he does a combination of yoga and Alexander technique that is very insightful. And I love to say that he has got more than 70 years experience, but he's not that old. It's just that he has been teaching yoga for 50 and Alexander technique for 20, 30. So if you put them together, that gets up to over 70. It sounds good to me.
Very good. And I could do what the old yogis do and add 20 years to my age. Everyone will say how young I am and how good the yoga must be.
Yeah.
All yours, David.
Oh, mine. Okay. So when did I write? I can't even remember. It was several years ago when I wrote the book. I should have worked out when it was. But I started. I've been thinking about writing a book for years and years and years, really. And because there's really when people are coming to me yoga class, there's a number of reasons. One, that when people are coming to me yoga class, they're asking, what's a good yoga book? What book can you sort of recommend? You know, in terms of that I could recommend. There's probably about one book, actually. There was one book that where the person who wrote the book, he'd been an Iyengar teacher and he'd got multiple sclerosis, so he'd had to rethink this whole process. And so his book was looking at how you may do the postures if you're very tight, medium. Yeah, so there was very, very, very little that you could recommend to people. That was one reason I wanted to write the book. Another was actually what really sort of got me going is if you have a marriage breakup, it's good to actually just have a project there. And so you can just to focus. And so that book gave me a real focus for a year. And I'd already written bits and pieces, articles, and I've got lots of stuff on my computer because I'm not a very methodical person, but I'll write stuff and then I'll sort of leave and I'll write a bit more and I'll leave it. So I had probably quite a bit of the book, maybe 30, 40% of the book already. And it was really, I really enjoyed doing the process. So I'd sort of get up about 5 in the morning and do a bit. And it seems like a big job to write a book. But there's how many pages? There's 160 or 170, 180 pages. So if you were to say that you're going to do a page a day, then it's not that difficult. But it seems when you're in the beginning, you're really wondering, are you ever going to get to the end of this process? And so unlike Rossi and Anne, I probably spent a lot of money getting this book done because I used designers, and also I had a very good editor because I sent the book to Pedro de Alcantara to have a look at and to make an introduction, and he said, oh, no. And he said, I've got this editor. And I'd already put it through an editor, but his one was really good. And I learned an awful lot about writing from having a book edited, just how to really simplify what you put down on paper And now actually when I write, I'm often writing, and I've got this editor in the background saying, you actually don't need these words. This is anything in excess you don't need. So I've tried to make the book as clear and as simple as possible. So I had all this material, and I had to somehow get it together in some sort of order. So I divided the book up into just a short introduction, you know, about me, about yoga, about my journey. And then I had a section really just looking at the basic principles of the Alexander technique. And then I had another section on, I wasn't quite sure what to call it. I don't even know what I ended up calling the section, but it was a section on, it's just called part 3 really, considerations regarding yoga practice, which wasn't really about the yoga pose or the breathing, but about things like pain science and breathing and meditation and the idea of tensegrity, which I've sort of revised a little bit. You know, a lot of stuff that you put in the book, you think a few years later you might want to change some of that stuff about how muscles work, and then the final section was a section on the looking at the yoga poses. And the difficulty with writing up, say, the yoga poses is that normally in a book you do this and this and this and this and this to go into a particular pose. And I really didn't want to do that so much as to, so I took the poses as groups, like twists and forward bends and back bends, side bends and standing poses and inverted poses, and sort of went something around the considerations that you'd have to think about with that, in terms of the underlying anatomical considerations, and also looking at the sort of way that people could get mixed up or injured or do them badly. And also I wanted to look at how would someone who's really tight, or someone who's really loose, someone who's hypermobile, etc., someone who's got an injury, how would they approach these poses? And so that was sort of how I went through that. And then it was trying to then bring really the principles of the Alexander technique also into describing, into looking at the different groups of poses. Some of you have written a book. Who's thinking of writing a book? Is anyone here? Only Penelope. Yeah. All right, I won't talk too much about the process of getting, I know Penelope was interested in how you got it published, but what I did was that I eventually then, I found a book designer, and I spent so much time on the internet getting good images, and also for actually demonstrating a lot of the yoga poses. We had some shoots also to do them. So it was sort of a mixture of the pictures that we've done and a picture of really getting good ones on the internet. And I still do that. I'm still doing that all the time, because when I'm running classes, I really like to use images for people. I think the images it gives so much more than what you can explain. And actually, when I'm looking at a book on the Alexander technique, I'll first of all look at if they've got images, I'll look at the images, and that's going to make me decide if I want to read it or not, because so often I find images which are not actually so good. So I finally got the book. I finally got this book published. It's called Yoga and the Alexander Technique, and I did the same. Well, actually, I think Rossi and Anne, they sort of followed me in terms of getting it done by with Ingram. So it's self-published, and if you self-publish the book, you actually get a lot of the money from it when it's sold, which is a very good reason for self-publishing. You'll actually make more money probably than with a publisher. And I actually got all the money that I spent back on, at least on this. And then I sent this book, and I thought, well, I want to get it done by a commercial publisher, because if you're self-publishing, you've got a certain market. So I could get it around sort of the Alexander community pretty much. You could get it around, but it was hard really to get it out widely. And so I sent this book off. I sent it off to first of all to Penguin Random House, and they sort of knocked it back. And then I sent it to North Atlantic Books, they publish Ted Diamond's books, and they took it. And that was just the second publisher I'd been to, which I think is very unusual if you want to get a book published. And so they said, well, we want to call it Smart Yoga. And I said, oh, that's it's a weird title. But I said, you know what you're doing? We'll call it Smart Yoga. So I'm now teaching Smart Yoga. It really wasn't my choice. Other people started talking, oh, you teach Smart Yoga. And it's sort of almost like becomes a brand. And the advantage with getting it done by a commercial publisher is that it sort of gets much wider distribution. And then as the book gets out there, then people start to read, and people who can relate to the book actually then start to get in touch with you and say, oh, you know, I got an invitation to go to China or here or there or whatever, just from the book. So are there any questions at that stage? Because otherwise we can do a little something from the book probably. Kay's got something, but she has to turn off her microphone.
When you're looking for pictures on the internet, do you have any advice on that? Because you can spend hours and hours, can't you? And some of them are expensive as well. Do you have any advice on finding pictures?
Yeah, you've got to spend hours and hours.
There's no shortcut there, David.
And the second thing is that there's a site called Pixabay, which has an awful lot of pictures on, which are free, or you just give a donation. And then, I mean, if you're doing a book, you have to make sure you've got the copyright.
Yes. In fairness, I was thinking of more for my own use with my students rather than writing a book.
Yeah, well, I think if it's for your students, you can just take it, I think, pretty much. But but certainly on Pixabay and then Shutterstock is you pay, but you don't pay an awful lot for the for the picture.
So how do you spell Pixabay? Is it P-I-X?
Pixabay, yeah, P-I-X. Pixabay, yeah.
All one word, or is it separated?
Yeah, Pixabay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Because I think for all of us as teachers, the images are really so useful and so powerful, really. You know, when I was thinking of, I'm just at the moment I'm running we're running a training. Actually, Kay's on that that training in yoga and Alexander technique, and so it's a bit like writing a book actually, because I think Melbourne's had the longest lockdown of anywhere in the world, just about. We had a huge lockdown here. So I had plenty of time to do that and to put stuff up online. Now, why was I saying that? Yeah, just in terms of oh, that's right. I'm just doing one at the moment on the directions. And how do you explain the directions, or how do you give the directions, or whatever? And it was today, I think. I'm just looking, and there's a lot of pictures of Alexander also. So just the head forward and up. If we want to explain, how do we explain? I mean, as Alexander says, it's such an inadequate and often confusing phrase. But can we see, if we just look at him and we see his hands there, and we see that, we can see him, we can see his hands, and we can see his direction through his thumb, through his index finger. It's almost like almost every finger there is giving a particular direction, and we can really get a sense of where we're going with that. So I think pictures are really so valuable there. Let's look at, and so I think from the Alexander technique and the way Alexander worked, he was doing the procedures that he had, the monkey, the hands on the back of the chair, the lunges, were really all procedures that were working with those what he described as the antagonistic pulls through the body. That he was actually working in those as much. He's working with the thinking process, but he's also working with that underlying structure, the underlying fascial and muscular and structure there, and beginning to work and to coordinate through there. And so a lot of the yoga that I teach, those of you who've been to my classes know that a lot of the stuff we do upright, don't we? A lot of it we actually do from standing poses. And especially when I'm working on Zoom, because if you've got a number of people there, you're not quite sure who's hypermobile, who needs to stretch, and so with the standing poses, you've really got the two sides. You've got to support yourself in upright. So if you've got someone who's really hypermobile, they've got to find the support within that. And if you've got someone who's really tight, they can work more with the stretch and the sort of stretching there, the opening there. So I thought we could look. We're not going to really do. We're going to look at how we might modify a sort of monkey or a lunge into a sort of yoga-y type of thing. Because the problem that we find, if I'm doing a yoga class, it's a general class with people. The monkey with the hands on the back of the chair. It's so detailed. There's really a lot within that, and we're wanting gradually, as people are coming to classes, to sort of work with that detail, but we're also wanting them to actually access some of that length, some of that opening as easily as possible. So what I thought we could look at, and then we can have a chat about that. We'll look at just a couple of ways in which we're going from a very Alexander technique procedure into a sort of yoga-y thing that we can work with people. So if the people, I think most of you have got a little bit of space there, and most of you have probably got a chair, and most of you hopefully have a back on the chair. And so what we could look at, and I just need to check. I've got the space here. Is first of all just standing behind the chair. So often in the beginning of a class, I'm really working just to make sure people are coming up from over the feet. Because in the beginning of standing here, what we'll notice in the general class is that people are going to push the pelvis forward and basically pull the upper back. That's and stiffen. So when people come to yoga, they don't normally come and stand collapsed. They stand pulled up. So I normally spend just a little time getting people somewhat connected over the feet, somewhat and just in touch with that tendency to push the pelvis forward and lean back and to sort of grip through the legs. And then from here, it's just a matter of coming over into maybe a little monkey, but in the beginning, I don't normally stay here because mostly when people come over here, they'll either drop or they'll pull the back in, which is really common. So I often get them coming over and then beginning to take the chair forward so that they're beginning to rotate forward from the hips. And then we can work on asking to keep that length up through the front as they're coming over there. So we begin to get that overall length and expansion. And at the same time now, we've got the arms connected out of here as well in taking them forward, so that as people get more connected and coordinated in that, they begin to get that connection of the whole arms connecting out of the torso, which is where we want to be going when people are doing the yoga. So if people want to go into that and just see how you go with that. We're coming over, and then we've got to make sure. I'm just going to come and have a look at people here. Some of you are going into that, and as we're going into that, it's really keeping that. What I've got to ask people is to keep the length up the front, because as people stand in yoga upright, the tendency is to pull the back in and drop back. As people come forward here, often the tendency is for them to round over within that. So if we ask people to lengthen the back, they'll tend to pull the back in. But if we ask them to lengthen through the front, it's sort of a different thought. So if anyone wants to try that, yeah. And it's just then getting that whole connection through. So for the tighter people, they start to get a stretch. I'll often get a stretch in the hamstrings with this. And for the people who are really loose, you've really got to get them to keep that work, that coordination through the torso, through the torso, and not drop through the arms. And we're not going to, I'm actually, because we're not doing a yoga class, we're not going to take people into a dog pose today. But for those of you who know what a dog pose is, can you see what we're doing here is sort of what we do in a dog pose. People know when I'm talking about dog pose. You'll see this a lot. You see these dog pose is a thing that we'll do in virtually every yoga class. So it would be coming from here, and then we're coming up.
Oh, okay.
This way. So you'll all recognize that movement. If you haven't done yoga, you'll have seen people doing that. And so what you can see, what we're doing, taking the chair forward there, is almost the same as what we're doing in the dog pose. But in the dog pose, we're starting to work more strongly in that. So we're actually, it requires a degree of strength and a degree of flexibility. And again, so the sort of yoga poses that I like to do that are sort of easier to teach in a class are ones that combine the two sides, the strength and the flexibility, so that it'll work for someone who's really flexible, it'll work for someone who's quite tight, but that it'll sort of work in different ways, and that so that it's really starting to activate that opening and expansion through the body, but not in a way that's pulling the body apart. You know, if you've got someone who's really very flexible, they can take their arm up and virtually disconnect it from their body. That we're wanting to make sure that people are connected, that everything's connecting together. And often in the classes, we don't necessarily do a lot of poses, or we don't go quickly through the poses. But if you're really working with the direction within them, people at the end of a class say, "Oh, I feel taller." You know, people just come to a class. The really common thing you'll get once people have come out of the class, I say, "I feel taller." But it's for people who've been doing sort of regular yoga classes, I think it's quite a different approach. And I think that's why the book is sort of gets quite a lot of people who've done a lot of yoga, because if you're doing that really strong yoga over many years, but by the time people are 50 or so, it's starting to have a bit of a toll on the body. And they know it's not quite working for them, but they're not quite sure what it is. And it's sort of working with the technique and working in this way gives them another approach to the yoga.
I wanted to ask you about the editor, if I may. Did you actually talk to him, or was it just like emailing back and forth with his notes or whatever?
It was mostly just emailing back and forth. Yeah, it's an interesting process working with a good editor. It's a really interesting process. Actually, I had one editor. She was okay. She was also She had also been a yoga teacher, but this editor was. And unfortunately, he's retired now. He wants to write his own book. So, yeah. But yes, you learn and I was reading. It's interesting to read books about writing as well. I'm just trying to think. I can't remember the name of the book, but just about how to write really clearly and simply.
Was the editor Alexander Technique or Yoga?
No, not at all. No.
That's really interesting.
No, you don't need it.
You must think they need to understand what you were saying.
Yes, if they can't understand what you're saying, then there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good point. Good point.
Yeah.
And another thing I'm curious about is, like, your book got translated in Chinese, did it?
It's been translated into Korean.
Korean.
And it's being translated into Chinese, but it's taking an awful long time, because any book that's published in China has to go through the censor, apparently. And they've actually translated it, but it hasn't been published yet.
So I'm curious how it works with translations, because of course you can't, you probably don't speak Chinese or anything.
That's the trouble. I don't know, and I did, because I do teach in Taiwan, and so we've got two really good teachers there. They trained at our school, and with quite fluent in English and Chinese. And I did ask if they could see the translation, but they didn't. So you're a bit at the mercy of the translation. But I know Pedro told me he'd had a book that was translated into German, and he said the translation was so bad he paid for a his publisher wouldn't redo it, and he paid for someone to do it. He said he just couldn't let it go out. And of course, it's very hard to translate a lot of the Alexander, well, any concepts really, into another language, especially as different as Chinese, because I know I did speak Thai at one stage, and it's completely different from an Indo-European language. The whole, it's a very different process. It's completely different. So even from translating from English into French or Spanish or something, it's much, much, much further away. So I haven't had much feedback about the Korean edition.
Yes, I just wondered whether you work with flowing forms or whether you work with static forms and work within them to keep them alive with the directions, because so often the strong yoga ends up a bit fixed. And
yeah.
I wonder what your way around that is.
I tend to end up working with more static forms and trying to keep the flow within them. So I don't do a lot of the sort of moving from one pose to the other. I do sometimes, but especially with people who've been coming for a while, because each pose that they move into is the tendency to sort of disconnect.
And you work with the all those cat bends, because I've always thought, what is that about? That sort of overarching and overflexing the back. Yeah. What's your take on that? Because it feels so un-Alexander, to put it that way.
Yeah. Look, firstly, I think the spine is made to bend. I said there's nothing wrong with bending the spine. It can bend. It's just that we don't want to be bending it. But when we bend, we tend to do it in a completely habitual way. So if I bend, my bend is all from my thoracic. If someone else bends, it may be all from the middle of the back or somewhere from the lower back. And in the cat pose, then it just tends to people just tend to overextend and over flex through that movement. Yeah. I don't mind people doing a standing forward bend coming from the hips with the back rounding over, but it depends how flexible the spine is.
Yeah, it's about whether one overdoes the bend, as it were, by contracting into it.
Yes, yeah. But mostly I won't do any sort of bending or flexing poses until we've done a lot at the beginning of the class, working with a lot of the lengthening and expanding poses. And I'm doing less and less and less back bends in the classes. I mean, the back bends are some of them are they sort of open up a lot of energy through the body. But of course, when you get, often the very flexible people live in a back bend. And so you're really not wanting to take them more into that. And if I'm working with back bends, it's trying to get movement into the spine, and the place where it tends not to bend.
It seems there might be quite a complicated relationship between pushing yourself a little bit more and slightly going out of your comfort zone to get more mobility, whilst keeping a hand of the kind of directions, and just going into an end gaining kind of, oh, I really want to get there at any cost. I wonder how you cope with that kind of balance in the way you teach people.
That's really what the book is about. Is about working that and with working with the pose in order to get what's the result of the pose. Actually, I was walking with somebody yesterday who'd had this knee. She had a really bad knee injury, and she told me she was doing all these exercises from the physio because she needed to get more bend in the knee. But she didn't actually understand what the exercises were for. And as soon as she understood what the exercises was for, because she's a very bright lady, she then worked out what she needed to do herself, which was different from what the physios were asking you to do. So first of all, we need to do what's the reason we're doing a pose. Secondly, we need to understand that the most important thing is stability. Is much more important than flexibility. I'd much prefer to have a stable spine than a flexible one. Yeah, so we certainly want that central stability through there, and that the flexibility is really secondary. We are working with the thing to get more flexibility that somewhere. Then, you know, if people are say doing a hamstring stretch, I want to stretch the hamstring, and it can be good. You know, some people are very tight right up through here, so it's not necessarily a bad thing to stretch the hamstring. But then if I stretch, you know, what we see is people coming over like this, so they sort of stretch the hamstring, but we don't get the overall connection through the whole body with that. So it's starting to ask people when they're looking to get a particular flexibility to work that in conjunction with the connection through the whole system, you know, the head, neck, back. So it's sort of a different, it's an approach that you often in yoga classes, people are given. So when I was doing stuff like Iyengar yoga, then there was a fixed particular form for each pose. So each pose, you had your foot in a particular arrangement, you had your pelvis in a particular arrangement, and this was not necessarily related to each individual so much. So it's that we're not wanting to put our body to use our body to get into a pose. We're wanting to use the pose in a sense to get into our body, to sort of connect ourselves through the body. And so it's taking away the idea of gaining a particular movement or shape or flexibility or strength, and taking the awareness more onto that coordination, which is really what the Alexander technique's about anyway, isn't it? So will we do one more? So within yoga, there's a lot of different sort of standing poses where I'm just gonna, so this is someone doing, and it's a sort of a lunging movement, isn't it? What we're seeing, but we can see that it's really, you know, from our point of view as Alexander teaches, it's pretty bad, isn't it? So that we've got the whole sort of tightening and compression through the back. We've got the arms that are pulled forward to the lower back, the upper back narrow, well, the whole back narrowed really, or we get, in this one, we get, instead of getting the back, we get the whole back collapsed in here. So there's a lot of yoga poses that work around lunges. And so let's have a look at how, I won't do this particular one. We'll do one that's more, a more symmetrical one. That one's off to the side. We could come to chair. Often when I get people to move into a lunging movement, I'll normally get people to step back into it. Because normally when people step forward into a lunge, the impulse is going to be to do this. We can teach people not to do that. But if we're doing a general class, we'll often get that the head will tend to move back and the back will tend to shorten. And so I'll often get people to stand in front of the chair and really to really send the head is going forward and up. And they can bring the back foot onto the floor. And the interesting thing in this one is that I ask people in doing this to have their back foot facing forward. If you have a look at your back foot, you may find that it's actually not facing forward. You'll feel like it's facing forward, but it isn't. You might have really excellent sensory awareness, but for most people, it'll feel like it's forward and it won't be. And then I just get people to send the knee a little way forward here, for example. And then we've got to have that support from under the floor, under the foot, coming back into the pelvis, so that the tendency in this then as we come forward, and what we saw in that picture is that as she bends the knees, the whole back gets pulled in. So we're wanting to be able to have the back here. So this is like a simple lunge. And then sometimes from here, I'll get people again to come forward from here. They can actually at this point begin to straighten the front leg and to come up and to begin to hinge and come forward as they're coming over here. So it's very similar to what we were doing from that sort of monkey pose. So this one sort of gives us the stretch in the hamstring of the front leg, and at the same time we really get that length up through the front as we do that, coming forward. And so this one is really teaching people really to get that support from under the feet. So we don't want people just to sort of collapse into this. We're really wanting to get the work here. If you've got more flexible people, I might be getting them to take their hands down lower than what I'm demonstrating, because if I take them down too low, I'm going to lose the length here. But I can get that overall length and expansion, extension as I come forward there. So I'm working both with the stretch in the leg and the whole length and expansion through the torso. You could do the other side if you've done one side. So again, we're coming. So the beginning of the lunge, it sort of works with the stretch through the calf of the back leg. And then as we come forward and straighten this leg, then it begins to work up through the back of the leg there. And that we continue to really keep that opening and expansion up through the front. So I'll often ask people to think of that distance, say from the pubic bone to the rib cage. And I'll often ask people to try straightening that leg, the front leg, that we really activate up through that front leg. All right, and then you could come up. You could come up from there. Then it's interesting to see how we step forward as well, isn't it? There's all those points, but we can sort of work these much the same as we work in some of the Alexander procedures, really. And what we know with the Alexander procedures, I think there's really, I mean, Alexander was mostly the monkey and the hand on the back of the chair, wasn't it? Maybe the lunge.
Lunge, yeah.
And the lunge. And I think to do 3 years of them, it's quite a lot. It's good to add a little bit more in which we can really get the opening within that.
Thank you so much. One thing I just want to add that didn't come up is that sometimes you walk into one of David's classes, the advanced one, and there may be 9 people doing 9 different things. They've got 9 different poses, but they're all doing the same thing. So they're all working on the same stretch or the same point, what the exercise is for. But they're all looking different because they all have got different bodies. So based on their injuries or based on their strength or based on the flexibility, you may have 9 different ways to do the same stretch.
I just wanted to say that I used to do, before training at David's school, I used to do a lot of Iyengar yoga as well. And I remember that at the end of the training, I was going through some yoga books because I was thinking it would be good to maybe do some other poses which we don't do so often at school, or which, you know, some poses you don't get to do. So I was looking through some books to get more inspiration. And I found it really hard to look at the pictures after the training and after what I've learned at the school, because I could see all the shortenings and stuff. So for me, David's book is phenomenal in terms of just like going through and getting that bit of inspiration on like seeing an actual useful pictures for me.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'd like to add that I was terrified of yoga at the school because I came to Alexander through quite a severe injury caused in an Iyengar yoga class when I tried to imitate the shape of the pose rather than looking after myself. And I've completely changed my attitude now because I understand yoga. David's yoga is fantastic because it allows me to work at the conditions that I need to work at, and I'm quite stiff. And I just discoordinated myself terribly trying to follow other yoga practitioners, really. And I find David's yoga, in fact, I must sign up for your next course, David, just those little 2 ones today, and I'm already remembering how good it is.
And I'm still doing all those online classes. It's really weird because I've done the online class. We're sort of all back to more or less normal in Melbourne now, but we've got all the people from overseas now in the online classes.
Yeah, which is fantastic. I miss the adjustments, though. The adjustments that you do are so great as well. Sometimes my body doesn't understand the pose until I feel your adjustment, and then I'm like, oh yes, that's it.
Yeah, I know, but I've actually got to being able to talk people through it better now. I mean, one thing the pandemic's done is really forced us all to think, well, how do we really refine our language? And if we haven't been observing before, we really need to observe now. You know, it's not just that we feel with our hands. We actually need to see precisely what people are doing with themselves, because it's only from what we can see that we can give people effective instructions, really.
Yeah, I actually came to the training course via getting David's book. So it was David's book that inspired me to do the training course, and mainly because I was brought up in a teacher training school for Alexander technique, that the teacher really, although he could do yoga, really didn't think it was a very good idea.
Yeah.
And now I've been on the course for I don't know, we've been on it for now 5 weeks, is it? I'm beginning to get it now. I'm beginning to understand that actually yoga in the way it's taught isn't a very good idea for most people. But if it's taught in the way David suggests, then it can have a huge amount of benefits. So I think, getting the book out there is a really good promotion for getting people to think about approaching yoga in a different way and not end gaining.
Yes, I agree. And not just seeing it as a thing for super flexible people to do, who are very good at achieving certain bendy poses, and everybody else tries to force their body into the same shape, which just leaves you feeling terrible. Whereas after David's classes, I don't know about you, but I feel like my spine is really feeling great. It feels a little bit longer, a little bit looser. It's really good.
I have a question, Dave. So when you were writing the book, did you, how much did you think about who you were writing for, whether it was yoga teachers, Alexander teachers, people who'd never done yoga before, people who'd done yoga but not Alexander work? How did you kind of get your head around who to write for?
Yeah, I didn't want to write just a really simple book. I wanted actually to write a book for people who'd gone a little bit, whether it was into yoga or Alexander technique. The audience was really Alexander teachers and yoga teachers, or people who were sort of seriously into yoga. It wasn't done as an introductory yoga book or even an introductory Alexander book, although the beginning of it on the Alexander technique is sort of an overview and introduction to the technique. But there's a lot of them out. There's a few good, more introductory or even slightly deeper introduction to Alexander technique. But there wasn't really anything on yoga that I knew. So it was really aimed at that sort of audience.
Thank you, David, very much. And
Yeah.
thank you everyone for coming today. This was the first one we are learning on the job, but it is really enjoyable to be here with you. And in 2 weeks' time, this time in the afternoon, so it will be from 7 to 9, we have got 2 other lovely authors. And one is here today, is Penelope. And then we'll have Glenn Park with us. So in 2 weeks' time, we have the next session. We have got 4 in these blocks. Most of you are both the 4. You'll get the recordings, and the recordings will be active till January, basically. The next one will be at 6 p.m. in the UK and 5 a.m. in the morning in Melbourne. If you've got any suggestion on how to make things better, just send an email to us. And I declare this finished. So if you've got to go, if you've got to make a run for it, make a run for it. If you want to stay another 5-10 minutes to chat away, it was meant to be the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes before this to chat away, but we were so interested in doing things that we ended up just Alexandering all of David's time, and I kind of enjoyed it. So I hope that was okay.
And thank you all for coming.